The jar of blackberry preserve slipped from my hand and shattered on the kitchen floor the moment my phone rang. I don't know why I remember that detail so clearly. Maybe because everything that came after felt exactly like that something precious, something I had spent years carefully tending to, suddenly broken open and bleeding out across the tiles. It was a Tuesday morning in early October, the kind of morning where the fog sits low over the ridge and the air smells like wood smoke and wet leaves. I had been up since 5, the way I always am, because 63 years of early mornings don't just disappear when you retire. I'd already fed the chickens, already had my coffee, and I was standing in my kitchen in Harlan County, Kentucky, doing the thing I do every fall, putting up the last of the season's blackberries before the cold came in for good. When I saw my granddaughter's name on the screen, I smiled. She never called this early. She was 26 and newly married and living her life out in Franklin, Tennessee, which was only 4 hours away but felt like another world sometimes. She worked at a dental office during the week and spent her weekends gardening and cooking and being exactly the kind of young woman that made me feel like maybe we had done something right in this family. I answered on the second ring. There was no voice, just breathing. Shallow and wet, the kind of breathing that a person does when they are trying very hard not to make any sound at all. "Sweetheart?" I said. "Are you there?" A long pause. Then barely above a whisper, barely more than air passing over her lips. "Grandma, I need you. Please don't tell him where I am." I put the phone on speaker and was already reaching for my keys before she finished the sentence. She told me she was at the Walmart on the edge of town. She told me she had walked there. She told me she had been walking for almost 2 hours, in the dark, without shoes. She told me she didn't know who else to call. She was 7 months pregnant. I drove those 4 hours in 3.5. I don't remember most of it. I remember the fog on the mountain roads, and I remember praying out loud to a God I sometimes argue with, and I remember calling my brother from the car and saying just 6 words, "Meet me in Franklin. Bring Marcus." Marcus was my brother's son. He was 34 years old, had done 2 tours in the Army, and was the kind of man who showed up when you needed him without asking any questions until after the situation was handled. My brother was 67 and had bad knees and good sense. Between the two of them, they were exactly what I needed. I found my granddaughter sitting on the curb behind the Walmart, near the loading docks where no one would see her. She was wearing a thin cotton dress that was torn at the shoulder. Her right eye was swollen almost completely shut. Her bottom lip was split and crusted with dried blood. Her feet were wrapped in plastic grocery bags that someone, a kind stranger, I later learned had given her when they saw her limping through the parking lot. She looked up when she heard my car, and the sound she made when she saw me, that low, broken animal sound of relief, is something I will carry in my chest for the rest of my life. I got out before the car had fully stopped. I crossed the pavement and I knelt down on that cold asphalt and I put my arms around her as carefully as I could and I held her. "I've got you," I said. "I've got you. You're safe." She cried for a long time. I let her. When she finally stopped, I pulled back and looked at her face. I touched her cheek with the back of my hand, gently, the way I used to when she was small and had a fever. "Tell me," I said. She looked down at her hands. She had been picking at the skin around her thumb, another thing she did when she was frightened, the same as when she was 8 years old and had to speak at her school recital. "It was his mother," she said. It was her. I had met my granddaughter's mother-in-law exactly 4 times. Once at the engagement party, once at the wedding, once at Thanksgiving the year before, and once when she appeared unannounced at my granddaughter's house on a Sunday afternoon and rearranged the furniture in the living room while my granddaughter stood in her own doorway and said nothing because she had learned by then that saying something only made it worse. The woman was from old money. East Tennessee old money, which is a particular kind of money that comes wrapped in Bible verses and propriety and an unshakable belief that certain families are simply better than other families and that bloodlines, real bloodlines, the right bloodlines matter more than almost anything else in this world. My granddaughter's father was my son. My son was half Cherokee, the same as me, which made my granddaughter a quarter. It had never meant anything to us except pride. Our people had survived things that would have broken a less stubborn nation, and we carried that the way you carry good jewelry quietly, but always present. It meant something very different to her mother-in-law. "She came over yesterday afternoon," my granddaughter said. "He was still at work. She came in and she sat down at the kitchen table and she told me that she had been patient, that she had tried to accept things, but that she could not, in good conscience, allow her grandchild to be born carrying." She stopped, pressed her lips together. She said mixed blood. She called it mixed blood. She said no child of her son's line should come into this world carrying what she called a taint. The cold morning air sat between us. "I told her to leave," my granddaughter continued. "I told her to get out of my house. I had never spoken to her like that before. I had never spoken to anyone like that before. And she looked at me like I was something she had found under a rock. And she said, 'That's exactly the problem with your kind. No breeding, no restraint.'" She had stood up. My granddaughter had stood up and pointed at the door. And the woman had laughed, a short, clean laugh like a door closing, and she had picked up her purse and walked toward the front of the house. She hadn't left. She had walked to the kitchen instead. And she had picked up the ceramic fruit bowl that sat on my granddaughter's counter, the one I had given her as a housewarming gift, hand-painted, blue and white, and she had brought it down against the side of my granddaughter's head. My granddaughter didn't remember much after that. She remembered the floor. She remembered the sound of the woman's heels on the hardwood as she walked out. She remembered lying there for what felt like a very long time, one arm curled around her belly, not because she had decided to do that, but because her body had done it automatically, the way a body does when something inside it knows what matters most. She had come to with her cheek on the cold kitchen floor and the fruit bowl in pieces around her head and the late afternoon light turning orange through the window. She had lain there for a few minutes just breathing, checking herself the way you do fingers, toes, the baby moving, yes, still moving, still pushing gently against her ribs, and then she had gotten up. She hadn't called her husband. She had thought about it. She had stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and thought about calling him. And then she had thought about the fact that in 3 years of marriage, she had watched him receive 12 phone calls from his mother and end 10 of them by saying some version of, "You're right, Mom." And she had put the phone down. She had walked out of the house in what she was wearing, and she had not looked back. "Where is he now?" I asked. "I don't know. Work, maybe. Or her house." She paused. "She'll have talked to him by now. She'll have told him something. She'll have figured out a story." I nodded slowly. "Does anyone else know where you are?" "No." "Good." I helped her to her feet. "Let's get you somewhere warm." I took her to a motel 12 miles from the Walmart, paid cash, gave a name that wasn't mine. It was a habit from the years when my mother used to say, "When you don't know who's listening, stop talking and start moving." Old mountain wisdom. The kind that keeps you alive. I got her cleaned up. I found a drugstore open nearby and bought supplies, antiseptic, gauze, 2 bottles of water, food she could eat without chewing too hard on the left side. The wound on her head was below her hairline, not deep enough for stitches, but it had bled considerably and dried in her hair. I spent an hour working it clean with a warm washcloth while she sat on the edge of the bathtub and told me the rest of it. The rest of it was worse than the beginning. 3 months earlier, her husband's mother had called him. My granddaughter had been in the next room, folding laundry, not listening on purpose, but listening the way you do when someone is on the phone and not bothering to lower their voice. She had heard the phrase, "That child won't look right." She had heard people will ask questions. She had heard her husband say, very quietly, "I know, Mom, I know." He had never mentioned it to her. She had never mentioned that she heard it. They had continued living in that house together, sleeping in that bed, eating at that table, going to the hardware store on Saturday mornings, the way they always had, and underneath it all, this thing had been sitting there, quiet and growing, like mold behind a wall. 6 weeks after that phone call, his mother had started showing up more often, once a week, then twice, then sometimes 3 times, always when my granddaughter's husband was at work. Always bringing something, a casserole, a magazine, a piece of advice about nursery paint colors, and always managing to work in some small comment about the neighborhood, about certain kinds of doctors, about the importance of knowing where your family came from. My granddaughter had told me none of this. I asked her why. She was quiet for a long moment. Because I kept thinking I was reading it wrong, she finally said, because she was always so polite about it. Because I thought if I said it out loud it would become real. And because she stopped. Because what? Because I didn't want you to see it. I didn't want you to know that his family, that someone could look at you, look at what we come from, and think that was something to be ashamed of. She looked up at me. Her good eye was very bright. You worked so hard, Grandma. You gave us so much. I didn't want you to know that someone thought that wasn't enough. I sat with that for a moment. I put my hand over hers. Baby, I said, there is not a single person on this earth whose opinion of our blood means one thing to me. Not one. Do you understand that? She nodded. Good, I said. Now let me make some phone calls. My brother arrived at 2 p.m. with Marcus and with a bag that contained 3 changes of clothes for my granddaughter, a box of prenatal vitamins, 2 sandwiches from a deli he had stopped at on the way, and a calm that I have always relied on the way some people rely on medication. He looked at my granddaughter's face for a long moment without saying anything. Then he looked at me. Tell me what you need, he said. That was the thing about my brother. He had watched our mother raise 6 children on next to nothing in the eastern Kentucky mountains, and he had watched our grandmother before her do the same, and somewhere along the line, he had absorbed the understanding that what women in our family needed most, in a crisis, was not someone to take over. It was someone to hand them the right tool and get out of the way. Marcus, meanwhile, had sat down next to my granddaughter and was talking to her in a low, even voice about something completely unrelated, the deli he had stopped at, the fact that they made their own bread, a story about a time he had gotten lost trying to find a deli in Clarksville that turned out to have closed 2 years prior. He was making her laugh. Small laughs, careful ones, but real. I had always loved him for that. We talked through what we knew and what we needed to find out. Her husband did not yet know where she was. She had turned her phone off after calling me, and it was still off. Her mother-in-law did not know where she was. That was the window we had. But we needed to think about what came next, and that meant thinking carefully. Marcus made 2 calls from his own phone. I don't know who he called, but within an hour he had the name and contact information for a family law attorney in Franklin who had handled domestic abuse cases for 20 years and had, according to Marcus's source, never lost one that had gone to trial. He had also, and I did not ask how, confirmed that the house my granddaughter shared with her husband was in both their names, that there were 2 vehicles registered to the address, and that her mother-in-law's home address was a property that had been in the family for 31 years. She's done this before, my brother said quietly. He said it as a fact, not a question. A woman who walks into someone else's home and does what she did, that's not the first time she's put her hands on something that didn't belong to her. He was right. The attorney's name was Patricia. She was in her late 50s and had the kind of voice that sounded like she had spent decades being the most prepared person in every room she walked into. When I called her that evening and laid out what had happened, she was quiet for exactly 15 seconds and then said, "Is your granddaughter safe right now?" "Yes." "Good. I need you to do 3 things before we speak again. 1, she needs to be examined by a doctor tonight, not tomorrow. Everything needs to be documented. 2, do not contact the husband or the mother. Not for any reason. 3, do not go back to that house without me. We took my granddaughter to an urgent care clinic that evening. The doctor on duty was a young woman who asked all the right questions in the right order and documented everything without being asked twice. She confirmed no fractures, no signs of fetal distress, a mild concussion. She gave us a printed record and told my granddaughter to follow up with her OB within 48 hours. While we were in the waiting room, my granddaughter's husband called my phone. I let it ring. He called twice more over the next hour. Then he called my brother. Then, presumably getting nowhere, he stopped. His mother called once. I looked at the number, let it ring out, and said nothing. The second night, my granddaughter finally slept. She slept heavily, the way a person sleeps when they have been holding themselves rigid for too long and the body finally just takes over. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the parking lot and thought about what came next. There was a version of this story where my granddaughter went back, where the attorney negotiated a quiet separation, where the house was sold, where the mother-in-law was never held accountable for anything she had done because my granddaughter was too tired and too pregnant and too afraid of what a court case would cost in time and money and emotional currency she didn't have. I had watched that version of events happen to other women. I had watched them make that calculation and accept those terms and live with that bargain for the rest of their lives. I was not going to let that be her story. In the morning, I called Patricia back. By 10 o'clock, she had filed an emergency protective order against my granddaughter's mother-in-law. By noon, that order had been granted. By 2 in the afternoon, a deputy had delivered it to the mother-in-law's house on the 31-year-old property. My brother told me later that when Marcus drove by the house that evening, just to confirm the delivery, there were 2 cars in the driveway and all the lights were on. Good, I thought. Let them talk. Let them figure out their story. Because while they were talking, we had already told ours. What they had not counted on, what she, in particular, had not counted on, was the neighbor. The woman who lived 3 houses down from my granddaughter had a Ring camera. It covered her driveway and, at a certain angle, a portion of the street. She had seen the mother-in-law's car parked in front of my granddaughter's house on the afternoon in question. She had seen her arrive. She had seen her leave 40 minutes later, and she had noted and mentioned to her husband at the time that the woman was moving quickly and that there was something in the way she walked that the neighbor, who had been a nurse for 30 years, had recognized as agitation. The neighbor had never cared much for the mother-in-law. She had been on the receiving end of one of those polite, cutting remarks at a block party 2 summers ago and had not forgotten it. She called Patricia's office voluntarily. She offered the footage. She offered her testimony. Patricia called me that evening and said, in that same prepared voice, "I want you to know that in 20 years I have seen cases turn on smaller things than this. The following weeks were not easy. I will not pretend they were." My granddaughter's husband hired an attorney of his own, and for a while there was a period where messages were being sent back and forth through lawyers, and my granddaughter would sometimes receive them and sit with them for a long time without speaking. I stayed with her. I had arranged for a neighbor back home to look after my chickens, and I had brought 2 bags this time, and I was not going anywhere. He came, once, to where we were staying. Not in anger that surprised me. He came quietly, hat in his hand in a way that was not quite metaphorical, and he asked if he could speak to her. I looked at my granddaughter. She nodded. I gave them the room and stood outside the door. My brother sat in the car in the parking lot in case he was needed. They talked for almost 2 hours. I heard crying through the door, his as well as hers. I heard silences that lasted long enough to mean something. When he came out, he looked like a man who had just put something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. He looked at me. "I knew," he said. "I didn't do anything, and I knew, and I have to live with that." "Yes," I said. "You do." He nodded. "What do you need from me?" "The truth," I said. "On the record. All of it." He gave it. Every phone call his mother had made, every comment he had dismissed, every moment he had chosen the easier path instead of the right one. His attorney advised him against it, and he did it anyway. Whatever else I can say about that man, and there is quite a lot I could say, I will say that when it came down to it, he chose his wife over his mother, and he chose truth over comfort, and those are not small things, even if they came too late. The mother-in-law hired the best attorney available in that county. She had the money for it, and she used it, and there were 2 months where it seemed like the weight of the thing might tip in her direction. But you cannot unring a bell, and you cannot undeliver a protective order. And you cannot unsee a woman who spent 40 minutes in a house she had no right to be in and left with that particular kind of walk that a 30-year nurse had noticed from 3 houses away. She was charged with assault and battery. She was charged with assault on a pregnant person, which carries enhanced penalties under Tennessee law. She was 61 years old and had never had so much as a parking ticket, and her attorney made much of that. Patricia made more of the photographs of my granddaughter's face, of the medical record, of the fruit bowl, which had been photographed by the Franklin police when my granddaughter filed her report, and which had been my housewarming gift, and which was blue and white and hand-painted and now in shards in an evidence bag. She took a plea in the end. 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory counseling, a no-contact order that covered my granddaughter, her husband, and the baby for a period of 5 years. It was not everything. It never is. But it was something. It was her name on a document that said what she had done. It was her face in a courtroom where people could see it. It was the fact that when she is 70 and someone looks her up, there will be a record, and that record will say what she chose to do with her hands on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I will take it. My great-granddaughter was born on a cold Thursday morning in early December, at 6:14 inches the morning, at a hospital in Franklin, Tennessee. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces, and she came into the world with a full head of dark hair and the particular expression of intense grievance that all newborns have, as if they are already composing a list of complaints. I was in the room. My brother was in the waiting area. Marcus had driven 4 hours and was also in the waiting area, eating vending machine chips and pretending he wasn't nervous. My granddaughter's husband was holding her hand. He had been holding it for 11 hours. He did not let go once. When they placed the baby in my arms, I stood by the window where the early morning light was just beginning to come in gray and thin, and I looked at this small, warm, perfectly furious new person, and I thought about my grandmother. About her grandmother. About the long line of women who had carried exactly this kind of weight in their arms in exactly this kind of early morning light, and who had looked down at exactly this kind of face, and who had felt exactly this. The particular and unreasonable certainty that nothing in the world is stronger than this. Nothing ever has been. "Do you have a name?" I asked. My granddaughter looked at her husband. He nodded. "Rosalie," my granddaughter said, "after great-great-grandma, my grandmother's name." I pressed my lips to the top of that dark head, and I felt the whole long thread of it, every woman who had ever loved and survived and kept going, and I held it there for a moment before I gave her back. Outside, the sky was getting lighter. The fog would be sitting on the ridge back home in Harlan County. My chickens needed feeding. The last of the season was always the hardest and the sweetest. I looked at my granddaughter, bruises long faded now, eye clear, whole, and I thought about the woman who had tried to tell her that this bloodline was something less than it was. She had probation papers with her name on them. She had a counselor she was required to see every 2 weeks. She had an empty house to go home to because her son had moved into an apartment closer to the hospital and was, by all accounts, working very hard on becoming someone worth forgiving. And we had Rosalie. We had 7 pounds and 2 ounces of dark hair and fierce eyes and a name that went back further than anyone in that county courthouse could trace. I handed the baby back to her mother, and I went out to the waiting room where my brother and Marcus were sitting in plastic chairs, and my brother looked up at me and I nodded, and he closed his eyes for a second, just a second, and I saw his shoulders drop about 2 inches. "Well?" said Marcus. "Rosalie," I said, 7'2", dark hair, already angry about something. Marcus laughed. My brother reached over and put his hand on my arm, and we sat there for a moment, in those plastic chairs in that fluorescent light, while the morning came in through the window, and I felt something I can only call the right kind of tired, the kind that comes at the end of something that was worth every ounce of what it cost you. Outside, the sky had turned from gray to the pale gold that comes just before the sun clears the ridge. In a few hours, we would drive back in. I would feed my chickens. I would start another jar of preserves, and this time, I would not drop it. But right now, I sat in this chair in this light, and I thought about a girl on a curb behind a Walmart with grocery bags on her feet, and a whispered voice that said, "Please don't tell him where I am," and I thought about how far she had come from that curb, and how far we had carried each other to get here. Some blood runs thin. It runs cold and cautious, and it looks for the easiest door. And some blood, my grandmother's blood, my mother's blood, my granddaughter's blood, and now little Rosalie's blood runs like a river in spring, loud and cold and impossible to stop. That is the only kind I know how to be. That is the only kind I have ever wanted to be.